So what kinds of questions can we ask with data from this simple demo? The very simplest analysis is just to look at the differences in reaction time for valid versus invalid cues for a single SOA value and cue type. So here I was using a peripheral cue and an SOA of 150 milliseconds. And you can see on the right that I was about 130 milliseconds faster for valid cues versus invalid cues. And this difference was apparent with less than a minute of running the demo for data collection. So these peripheral cue effects can emerge very quickly. A good next step would be to repeat the experiment several times with the same type of cue, so in this case peripheral cue, but vary this SOA value. And make sure that each time you remember to write down your results before you reset and start with a different SOA. Then you can compare the difference between valid and invalid trials as a function of the time between the cue and the stimulus. If you plot these values, what you should find is that at very low or high SOAs, and on this app you can go from 0 to 500 stimulus onset asynchrony values. So at very low or very high SOAs, there should be no effect of the cue. And instead there's some intermediate value where the effect of this cue is the largest. So the largest difference in reaction time between valid and invalid cues. Now, where that exact value is really going to depend a lot on how you have that time slider up top calibrated. But for peripheral cues, if you've got that about set right, I'd expect that optimum to fall in somewhere in the 50 to 200 range. You can then repeat this data collection and analysis for a central instead of a peripheral cue. So for a central cue, the delay between cue and stimulus should need to be slightly longer to see the largest effect, probably somewhere around 200 to 300. But that cue effect could persist all the way up to the largest SOA available. Another potential analysis is whether the probability of cues being valid has any effect on the outcomes. So for this, I would suggest choosing the optimal SOA for each cue type, peripheral or central, and running two sets of trials, one with a very high ratio of valid to invalid cues, say 5-to-1, and one with a very low ratio, say 1-to-1 valid to invalid cues. And again, you can set that with these sliders on the left. So there you have 1-to-1, and you could go as high as 10-to-1. Just keep in mind that as you increase that ratio, you'll have many fewer invalid data points contributing to that reaction time measurement. So for involuntary attention, the validity of the cue should actually have minimal impact on the reaction time difference. You should still see that difference between valid and invalid trials, regardless of how valid the cue is. For the central cue, the cue's ability to impact behavior should be much greater when it's mostly valid than when it's invalid. Another effect you may be able to see in this data is the concept of a speed-accuracy trade-off. So you could look for this in individual students by comparing their speed and accuracy when instructed to focus more on answering quickly or on answering correctly. If you ask them to emphasize speed, you would be most likely to see some errors creep in on the invalid cue trials. You could also see if this effect is present across your classroom, so across multiple subjects. Are there students who are faster but have more errors and other students who are slower but have fewer errors on average? This is also a chance to talk about data normalization. So if students in the class have very different average reaction times or reaction times in the neutral cue condition, you can talk about how you could normalize those responses before combining the data. So for example, by subtracting off everyone's neutral cue reaction time, or by only looking at the difference between valid and invalid cues, or the percent difference between valid and invalid cues before you start trying to combine data from across students into one of these plots.